Continuing from our previous video, if we think about intergenerational conflict, and we've been thinking about it in terms of genes in individuals, maximizing the fitness of the individuals that they are inside of. On the other hand, from the genetic point of view, siblings are up to half as good as the organism that they are in. An allele in an individual, there's a 50% chance that there are copies of that allele in the parent, 50% chance there are copies of that allele in siblings. So if you think about it from the genetic point of view, helping parents or siblings to reproduce is potentially helping the reproduction of copies of alleles that are in this organism itself. So now if we think about certain alleles for behaviors that are helpful, if the cost is not too great, a mutant gene for helpfulness might be selected. An allele in this individual that causes this individual to help these guys, it is 50% chance helping other copies of itself reproduce in doing so. And so we can actually broaden our definition of fitness. So direct fitness is when we're thinking about reproduction of a particular entity. If we add indirect fitness, so that's like helping increase the reproduction of other copies of that same gene in other individuals, if we take direct fitness and add indirect fitness, then we get a concept called inclusive fitness, which we can think about as the overall fitness of that allele, all the copies of that allele or that gene. Direct fitness is not straightforward, but fairly simple in a sense that we know we can focus on one individual, we know which individual we're focusing on. This indirect fitness, the benefit of that, is going to depend on how related they are. So this indirect fitness comes from the reproduction of relatives, but we have to discount it by this coefficient of relatedness that we looked at earlier. Taking this equation, realizing that we have to take into account the coefficient of relatedness, because that's what's determining whether those alleles are in those other individuals, we get an equation like this. The inclusive fitness is equal to the direct fitness, and then plus the indirect fitness. And indirect fitness has two components. The benefits being provided to relatives, so the change in the fitness of all those relatives, multiplied by the probability that they have that allele, and then we have to add them all up. And that's a positive contribution to inclusive fitness. But then we also have to reduce the inclusive fitness by the cost of doing whatever this behavior is. So with this equation, if we ask the question, when is a mutation for a helpful behavior advantageous, it would be when this second part is positive, right? So if negative C plus BR is positive, inclusive fitness will be larger than direct fitness. Individuals that have a helpfulness mutation will do better than individuals that don't. So that's equivalent to saying that BR minus C is positive. And this is something called Hamilton's rule. Hamilton's rule, selection for an allele that causes helpful behavior will be favored if the benefit to recipients multiplied by their coefficient of relatedness minus the cost is positive. Now this sort of equation here, this is an example of a mathematical model that we don't necessarily expect to be completely accurate all the time, but is a mathematical model that's simple enough for us to understand, and it highlights the three important things to think about when we're trying to figure out whether helpfulness can be selected. So when we think about evolution of helpful behaviors, cooperation, that sort of thing, we know that we're going to focus on the benefit. What benefits could the organism provide to others? The coefficient of relatedness, which relatives are being aided or should be aided, or when should the behavior be done to maximize the benefit to relatives as opposed to strangers. And then the cost, under what circumstances might the costs be minimized and make this equation, the left-hand side, more likely to be larger than zero. So Hamilton's rule is an example of a mathematical model that's kind of a conceptual model. It identifies three important factors that we want to look at when we're thinking about evolution of helpful behaviors. This is just a cartoon that you can take a little bit of time looking at. It's kind of making fun of this idea that when we think about providing helpful behaviors to other individuals, like in this example, helping someone move, the genetic relatedness of those relatives is something that we may want to consider. And of course, there are different points of view in doing helpful behaviors. Okay, so returning to biology on this planet, there's an example. There's a phenomenon called helpers at the nest. This is seen in a number of different bird species. And what helpers at the nest behavior involves is in many birds, young adults actually stay with their parents and provide food to the next generation of their parents. So these individuals are not reproducing, they're staying at the nest with their parents, and they're helping to feed the next generation of offspring. So this is definitely sort of helpful behavior. Those individuals are giving up their own reproduction. So let's look at Hamilton's rule. So the benefit, the increased food obviously increases the survival of siblings. Those siblings are related with 0.5 for the coefficient of relatedness if they're both parents are the same, but they're even related with a coefficient of relatedness of 0.25 if they are half siblings. And then what about the cost? Well, the cost might be minimal if opportunities for their own matings are limited, or helping reduces other costs. So under what circumstances might we expect this to evolve? Situations in which maybe matings as a young adult are not very probable, or if there are other, say, benefits to fitness. So looking at this cost aspect, this is a series of observations that were done with collared flycatchers, which is one of these birds. So in this figure here, this is looking at the reproduction of females that start reproducing at age 1, and on average, how many eggs do they lay? And that's on average around 6. And then comparing that to other females that exhibited the helpers at the nest behavior. So those females didn't have any eggs in the first year because they stayed at their parents' nest, helped their parents raise more siblings. But when they then started reproducing at age 2, then their nests on average had like 6.6 eggs. So that's like a 10% increase in the number of eggs that they were laying for the next 3 years just by taking that first year off. And so that phenomena will serve to reduce the cost. The cost is not that great for skipping a year of reproduction if those individuals are getting increased reproduction every year afterwards. This second plot here is showing how having extra eggs even at age 1 has a long-term consequence. So when individuals are given extra eggs, you can see their future reproduction goes down, versus individuals that were not given extra eggs, their reproduction actually goes up over time. So you can see that having reproduction in year 1, either a lot of it or not so much of it, is altering future reproduction. So this cost is reduced in these birds because although they lose this reproduction, they may make up for it if they live for a while afterwards. So we might actually expect to see this helpers at the nest phenomenon in bird species where this sort of process goes on in later life. Here's another example of a sort of helpful behavior. These are ground squirrels. Ground squirrels sometimes give alarm calls when they see predators. There's a definite cost to this because if one of these guys stands up and starts making the alarm call, then the predator is much more likely to attack them compared to some random ground squirrel that's not making noise. When there's a predator nearby, giving an alarm call to warn all the other ground squirrels is dangerous. It causes them to have more than twice the chance of being the one that is attacked by the predator. The benefit is provided to relatives, right? So any other ground squirrel that hears this will get the benefit. If they're a stranger, it provides no genetic benefit. But if they're relatives, these individuals will be helping their relatives survive because they get the alarm and they can hide. So when we start looking at when these ground squirrels make their alarm calls, what do we see? Females call more than males. Females actually call more likely when they're close to their relatives. So ground squirrels roam all over large kind of complexes where they live. When the female is in the area where her relatives are, she's actually much more likely to give an alarm than when she's in the part of the complex where she's not near relatives. Then when she sees a predator, she's actually much more likely to be silent. So we actually see them modifying their behavior based on whether the benefits are likely to go to relatives or non-relatives. And then here's one of the predators of ground squirrels, and it turns out that relatives cooperate. They get together more than non-relatives to remove these guys. These guys get in the complex. These guys can gang up on them. Individually, they can't beat them up, but as a group, they can drive them out. And the groups that drive these guys out tend to be relatives more than non-relatives. So these sacrificial behaviors, the alarm call and the actually participating in a mob, these are more likely when it's the relatives that are likely to benefit. So if we think about this sort of Hamilton's equation here, these benefits to relatives are the only benefits really from aiding an individual's own genes and relatives. Like we could imagine that maybe if individuals were helping other individuals, those individuals might remember it and help back. And maybe there are other aspects to the benefit that aren't dependent just on relatives. Maybe helping other individuals would end up in returned favors or something like that. So is this really all there is? Is it all just helping genetic relatives, or are there actually helpful behaviors to non-relatives, some sort of altruistic behavior? When the aid is returned, we might have extra terms in addition to these genetic relatednesses. But can we separate this altruism? So altruism would be helpfulness that doesn't immediately result in a benefit. Can we separate that altruism from kin selection? Kin selection is what we've been talked about, when the traits are selected because they provide advantages to relatives because those relatives are likely to carry copies of the same allele. Can we separate altruism from kin selection? Do we see extra benefits that are not based on relatedness, maybe extra terms here? So we could actually increase the size of our inclusive fitness term here. We have direct fitness, we have indirect fitness, reproduction relatives discounted by R, and then maybe an additional term and benefit received from other organisms, like an extra term out here that doesn't have relatedness but maybe has returned favors. Do we ever see altruism that's not explainable by kin selection, like sharing and getting along and being nice and generous? Turns out, not often, right? The world is not a happy place where everybody is nice to each other, organisms are nice to each other, but actually we do have some individual examples, and the example we'll talk about actually comes from vampire bats. So this is one of the best examples of altruism in nature that is not just explainable by kin selection. So this is a vampire bat. It's drinking blood from the foot of a bird. In vampire bats, they are social. They roost together in caves. Relatives and non-relatives mix with one another, and we can observe them to determine degrees of individual association, so which vampire bats hang out in the same part of the cave as other vampire bats every night. And by tagging them and doing genetic studies, we can also determine coefficients of relatedness. So we're able to determine how much time some bats spend with each other and how genetically related some bats are to each other. And the altruistic behavior, or kin-selected behavior, we'll be looking at is blood sharing. So blood sharing is the vampire bat goes out and gets some blood. It goes back to the cave, and other vampire bats that maybe haven't fed and are hungry, these guys can kind of vomit up a little bit of blood and like feed it to them, and that way both bats get some blood for the night. So it turns out that for an adult vampire bat going out, about 7% of the time, they don't actually get to feed that night. The 33% time is if they're a juvenile. So sometimes bats go out, they fly around all night, they don't get any food, and then they come back home and they're hungry. And bats can only do this about 3 times in a row before they'll die of starvation. So each bat has a 7% chance of not feeding, and if that happens 3 times in a row, then they'll die. So blood sharing is important because the other bat is providing food to keep this individual alive if it's missed some feedings. 110 blood sharing events were observed. 77 of them were parents to their own offspring. We can consider that just to be parental care and neither kin selection nor altruism. But in 21 out of 33 of the other cases, the researchers knew both the genetic relatedness and this degree of association, right? How much they hung out with each other in the cave. So they were able to see whether bats were sharing in a way that is just kin selection or maybe related to maybe trading back and forth. So their data looks like this, and using fancy statistics, they were able to show that both relatedness and association independently contribute to sharing. So here's the data. This is the degree of association score, and this is all bats kind of randomly chosen. This is the degree of association you would expect between bats that shared blood. Regurgitators is the degrees of association of the ones that did share blood with each other, and you can see it's kind of skewed to be more higher association values. So blood sharing happened between individuals that spent more time with each other than you would expect if it was just random. And then the degree of relatedness, this is if it was just random individuals being paired up, and then this is the degrees of relatedness of the ones that did blood sharing. You can see there's much more cases of siblings or half siblings. So both kin selection and association seem to be going on, and further experiments showed reciprocal altruism. Bats that gave blood to other bats were more likely to get blood from that particular bat in the future. So reciprocal altruism is when these favors are returned in kind of a one-by-one basis. So this example is not like the clearest possible example we can imagine. It's not as nice and neat as perhaps an example could be, but this actually just serves to show that cases of altruism that are not just kin selection are actually very rare in nature. The most extreme form of altruism or kin selection would be to give up reproduction completely. This is termed eusociality. Eusociality is when some individuals don't reproduce at all, they just help other individuals reproduce. There appear to be 3 requirements of this when we look at the species that are eusocial. Cooperative care of young, so a group of adults raise a group of young for the next generation. Reproductive division of labor, some individuals lay the eggs, other individuals take care of the juveniles. And then overlapping generations, so offspring help their parents have more offspring. This is seen in a number of species, so many insects, hymenoptera in particular. It's also seen in snapping shrimp, and it's also seen in naked mole rats, which are actually mammals. So this is particularly common in hymenoptera, and it's been proposed that this is because they have an unusual method of sex determination called haplo-diploidy. In haplo-diploidy, males are actually haploid. So here's what kind of a coefficient of relatedness diagram looks like for haplo-diploid organisms. If a female lays an egg and it is not fertilized, right, it's a haploid cell, it can actually still hatch, but it matures into a male. When a female and a male mate with one another, they produce diploid females. And so these females are siblings, related both through the mother and the father. These females are related to their brother only through their mother, right? The father is not involved at all in relatedness to the brother. So what's the coefficient of relatedness now? From the offspring to the mother. So this individual here, there's a 50% relatedness here, right? So an allele here, there's only a 50% chance in this individual, only 50% chance that it's in this individual. Offspring to father, these individuals, there's a 50% chance a given allele here is in the father. Sister to sister, if there's an allele here, there's a 50% chance it's from the mother. If it's in the mother, there's a 50% chance it's in the sister. That's this first term here. If that allele is in the sister, there's a 50% chance it's from the father. But if it's in the father, he's haploid, so there's a 100% chance that it is also in this sister. So that's the 0.5 times the 1. So then when we add these terms, we get 0.75. An allele in this individual, there's a 75% chance that it's in this individual. On the other hand, what's the chance of an allele in this female is in her brother. The allele here, 50% chance it came from the mother. If it came from the mother, 50% chance it went to the brother, and that's it, right? Because there's no relatedness through the father. So they're related by 0.25. So in fact, sisters are 3 times more related to each other at the genetic level than they are to their brothers, which is different from what we saw earlier when we were thinking about relatedness between siblings. So sisters are more related to each other than to their own offspring. So in fact, helping their mother raise more sisters might actually be better than reproducing on their own. If the options for behavior are reproducing on your own and having 10 offspring, or helping your mother produce more offspring and the mother could have 10 extra siblings, that actually would result in a higher fitness for that individual. What else does this influence of haplo-diploidy predict? Which ratio would give the highest fitness to individuals? For workers, the sex ratio that would result in the highest fitness for the workers would be 3 females for every male, right? Because the females are 3 times more related than the males are. So the optimum sex ratio in a hive of mixed females and females would be 3 times as many females as males. On the other hand, for the queen, because she is equally related to the female and male offspring, the optimum sex ratio for the individuals in the hive would be a 1-to-1 ratio. So we can actually see here a difference in the optimum sex ratio for all the workers in the hive being different for the workers and for the queen. So what do we actually see in nature? Here's data for a number of different ant hives from this textbook here. So looking at monogynous hives, that's a single queen. Of the number of different colonies, what percentage had each of these sex ratios when the workers were counted? You can see that they cluster around this 3 females to 1 male ratio, and that's optimum for the workers. For polygynous hives, that's multiple queens. In that case, a lot of these relatednesses between workers break down because there are lots of different mothers. And so then the optimum ratio is the same, and we actually see that as the ratio. And then one of the interesting things about ants is there are some species that go out and capture other ants from other nests and bring them back and force them to work. And when you look at those hives where genetic relatedness is actually almost completely disappearing, you see a 1-to-1 ratio. in the situation in which the worker's fitness is optimized by a 3-to-1 ratio, you see a 3-to-1 ratio, even though the queen's fitness is optimized by 1-to-1. It's only when the worker's sex ratio is 1-to-1 for the optimum ratio that you see hives with 1-to-1. This is interesting to think about. When we think about a hive with a bunch of ants or a hive with a bunch of bees, we tend to think of it as the queen bee is in charge and the workers are all doing her bidding to help her reproduce and maximize her fitness. But the sex ratio is optimized for the workers, not the queen. So if you think about it, it's more like the workers are using the queen to make more sisters because that's what's best for those workers, which is a very different way of thinking about how these hives work and whose fitness is being maximized by a reproductive system in which the workers give up their reproduction and help their mother have increased reproduction. But it turns out a haplo-diploidy is not the only cause of eusocialism, even within hymenopterans. So these hives with multiple queens or fathers are common, which eliminates this 3-to-1 ratio. And many eusocial species are not haplo-diploidy and vice versa. So naked mole rats, for example, are not haplo-diploid. So there is an alternative hypothesis, which is that the acquisition of complex nesting behavior in helpless larvae requiring care is more correlated with eusociality on the phylogeny of haplo-diploid insect families. So your book actually describes this, and it's an interesting example of multiple competing hypotheses for this really interesting behavior. The haplo-diploidy explanation was an earlier one, and it's a kind of striking one because it's a very interesting trait, but the actual true story might be more complex.